The Benevento rebellion would mark Malatesta's youth. Though Malatesta, through his relation to Bakunin, was already somewhat known in Italy, the Benevento uprising gave him the attention of socialists throughout Europe and beyond. This, however, also put a significant target on his back. Despite him and the other members of the Banda del Matesi being acquitted, the Italian government wasn't so quick to forget the embarrassment. They continuously harassed him and everyone he interacted with following his release in August of 1878. He stayed in Naples for barely a month before realizing that he and those around him were in danger. He planned on fleeing to Alexandria for a bit until the heat died down, but little did he know, this would begin his life in exile. He worked as a manual laborer in Alexandria for a short time, seeking to avoid all the attention. He was already being targeted by agents of the Italian government, but this was made much worse with one event. A fellow anarchist, Giovanni Passanante, attempted and failed to assassinate King Umberto of Italy. Following this, a massive wave of repression was launched throughout Italy, and the hostility carried over to the city of Alexandria, which had a large Italian population at the time. Protesters screaming "Die Internationalists" marched throughout the streets, and Malatesta was targeted even more by the government agents. Eventually, this boiled over with his arrest. It's a bit of a weird situation, since Alexandria is part of an independent, though heavily British-influenced Egyptian government that didn't have any actual reason to arrest Malatesta. But according to Luigi Fabbri, agents of the Italian police bribed the local officers to arrest him. In custody though, rather than being sent to Italy, he was loaded on a boat to Syria, having only 20 francs in his wallet at the time of his arrest. Immediately after he arrived, he went to the Italian consulate in Syria. Though he knew his risks of arrest were high if he returned to Italy, he thought it'd be better than staying in a completely foreign city with no work or house. Upon hearing his demands, the consul told him that his request was forbidden, and told him that a hotel was prepared for him in the city. No explanation was given to why he wasn't allowed back in Italy. Malatesta then demanded that if he did something wrong, to take him to jail instead. The consul then said that he did nothing of the sort, but was forbidden from returning regardless. Stuck in this Kafkaesque situation, Malatesta threatened to throw an inkwell at the consul's face. He motioned to do so before the consul frantically tried to see what he could do to accommodate Malatesta. He told Malatesta that there's no way for him to return to Italy, but he could send him to Smyrna instead. He boarded the ship to Smyrna with a few other socialists in the same situation. He forged a friendship with the boat's captain, who agreed that they let Malatesta stay on the ship past Smyrna. They sailed around the eastern Mediterranean before briefly docking in Italy. The Italian police quickly found out what was going on and demanded the captain to turn them over. The captain of the ship then said he'd only do so with a direct order from the French ambassador. The prefect of the town then came to the captain with a telegram, saying that he was permitted to but not ordered to hand over the revolutionaries. Upon seeing this, he showed it to Malatesta before ripping it up and continuing on. Malatesta in early 1879 arrived in Geneva. He met with a few other anarchists and began work like usual. In the small cafes of Geneva, he and a few other anarchists helped Kropotkin set up La Revolte, though according to Max Nettlau, the Herodotus of anarchism, Malatesta never wrote in it himself. Morte, casa, savoia. However, he wasn't in Geneva for long. He wrote an article basically calling Umberto I a little bitch for his treatment of the attempted assassin Passanante, which I find absolutely hilarious. The Italian government then petitioned the Canton of Geneva into expelling him, claiming he and a few others were vile criminals and malefactors. They were then expelled around April of 1879. The weird thing is that it seems like Malatesta was already heading to Romania and wasn't really informed of his expulsion from Switzerland. A friend in 1881 apparently reassured Malatesta that he wasn't actually expelled, or that he was only expelled from the Canton of Geneva and not all of Switzerland. Both of these would turn out to be false, but it won't be important until later. Malatesta spent some time in Romania where he barely scraped by working as a mechanic and teaching French. This trip mostly seems to be due to unspecified personal reasons. If you're wondering what happened to the rest of the gang, during mid-1879, Carlo Caffiello, who was living in Paris since the Benevento stuff, went to visit Geneva. It seems like he just barely missed Malatesta, who had already left when he arrived. He met up with Kropotkin and the other anarchists in the Geneva circle. Kropotkin would later on tell stories about how at this time, Caffiello and Emilio Covelli didn't really think that Kropotkin's paper was super good. While they respected Kropotkin himself, neither Covelli, Caffiello, or Malatesta would write anything in the paper. Well, there was one exception. On one afternoon, Caffiello came to Kropotkin with an article he wanted to be put in the paper. Apparently, it was an extremely radical article, the type that get the police on your back. Caffiello sort of wrote it as a challenge to see whether Kropotkin would really print it. Kropotkin obliged and published the article under his own name. Only later would he find out that this article was one of the many reasons given for his expulsion from Switzerland, though he never told that to poor Caffiello. As for Andrea Costa, who along with Caffiello and Malatesta were the remnants of Bakunin's old alliance, he was imprisoned in France. From early 1878 to mid-1879, Costa would be stuck in prison. During this time, he became more and more disillusioned. Previously fierce revolutionary became weary, and his old zeal began to fade. This experience would prove to be a turning point in his life. He saw the old insurrectionary forms of anarchism as too dangerous to continue, and began to seek out more parliamentary goals. He saw the insurrectionary movements as increasingly out of touch, too concerned with ideological consistency rather than the conditions on the ground. The failure of insurrectionary tactics wasn't noticed by Costa alone. Caffiello and Malatesta especially saw that change was needed. What made Costa unique amongst the three was his eventual defection to electoralism, though that would come later. He wouldn't abandon his old friends, but by this time he began to greatly differ on tactics and goals, a gap which would only grow over time. And with it, the previously steadfast revolutionary and one of the three remaining chains of the alliance began to rust. Later in 1879, Malatesta would travel to Paris where he'd meet up with Caffiello. They got caught up in the fiery and oftentimes violent Paris movement, though they'd only see the early parts of it. He joined protests, organized public meetings, and argued against Marxists in the paper. This all continued until at one demonstration, a supposed anarchist was promoting suspiciously violent tactics, telling young people to take up arms and throw bombs at the police. Malatesta moved closer until realizing that he was an agent of the Italian government. He then ousted the spy who was in reality trying to get anarchists to do illegal acts so they could be arrested. However, the Italian consulate complained to France, which gave them enough justification to remove a potential problem like Malatesta, who was soon expelled from the country. In early 1880, he spent some time in Brussels and went on a quick visit to London. He'd stay mostly in Brussels until June of that year, where he'd return to Paris with the passport of Fritz Robert, an old Jurassian comrade. However, he'd be quickly found out and sentenced to 6 months in prison for violating the expulsion, though this would be reduced to 4 months since he decided to spend the time in solitary confinement. Unfortunately, there was no Carlo Battistelli during this stay in prison. He'd spend the time miserably isolated and unable to aid his friends. One little thing that amused him in all this time was how, due to all of his aliases and fake passports that he used, the name on his cell read, quote, Errico Malatesta dit Fritz Robert de Santa Maria Cavour Vetera, which was far too long for the warders who just called him one of the long list of names. Malatesta was released after 4 months, though sadly, Fritz Robert, the man who lent him the passport, died shortly after. Also, remember how I said the unclear situation about Malatesta's Swiss expulsion would become important later? Well, now is later. He was never given an actual official notice of his exile, and so tried to head to Lugano in late 1880. He met there with Caffiello in December, who was presiding over the Upper Italian Federation for the Anarchist International. It seems like at this time Malatesta still had hope of returning to, or at least being close to, the Italian movement. However, these hopes were dashed in February of 1881, where he was arrested by the Swiss for violating the expulsion. He was only kept for a few weeks before being released, but with him being expelled from half of Europe, his only choice was to go north. He returned to Brussels, where he was once again arrested and told to go to London. At last, he arrived in London around March of 1881. This gave him some respite from the frantic situation he's been in since the Benevento revolt, though he was far away from home and all the ambitions he had there. He wasn't the only anarchist in this situation, as many had been forced to England as well. Kropotkin is one, and many German anarchists as well, who ended up writing the paper Freiheit. Hey, that's the name of the channel. Among those in London with Malatesta was by now his closest friend, Carlo Caffiello. His presence was no doubt welcome to Malatesta, who so much had been taken from. Andrea Costa by this time had completely defected to the reformist movement, becoming its new figurehead in Italy while Caffiello and Malatesta were stuck in exile. With it, the second chain of the old alliance broke. It was only Malatesta and Caffiello left. As the general situation worsened, Caffiello, at the very least, was still there, though, as it would seem, not for very long. Another help during this time was his old lover, Amelia Tonzio Zanadelli. By this time, she had married another anarchist, Giovanni Defendi, though us anarchists are always a bit pedantic, so technically they declared themselves in a free union rather than a religious or state-sanctioned marriage, viewing the institution as being created, quote, for the sole purpose of settling questions of property and inheritance, not offering any serious guarantee to the proletarians of either sex, consecrating the subjugation of women, committing wills and consciences for the future, without taking into account the characters involved, and opposing the dissolubility which is the basis of any contract. This did mean that they could split up if they wanted to, which was nice for the 19th century, though they never did. Anyway, Malatesta lived with them on 112 Islington High Street, and while in the typical British tabloid fashion, some papers made scandals of him living with his old lover, it seems like there was never anything scandalous going on. It's rumored that her son, born in 1883, Enrico, was Malatesta's, though there isn't any definitive proof, and it's equally likely they just named him that in Malatesta's honor. Regardless, for those interested in Malatesta's personal relations, there is scant information as, like I've said before, he very rarely let his personal life bleed into his political life. Still, having a few longtime friends might have comforted him a bit in this time of exile. Despite some of his home being brought to London, his exile from home was still undoubtedly a strenuous time. He constantly wanted to return to Italy, both for personal reasons and to further the anarchist movement there. To him, it seemed like there was so much potential just out of reach. Still, he didn't let that defeat him. He quickly worked on organizing the London anarchist elements into a cohesive force, and he had a major opportunity with the London Congress of 1881. It was created out of the death of the First International and sought to form a new anarchist international. Malatesta had a clear goal going in and sought to find a solution to the problem of coherent organization within the anarchist movement. Unfortunately, it seemed like he was one of the few people who did have these clear goals. As said in Max Nettlau's biography, quote, from Kropotkin's careful report in La Revolte, it can be seen that Malatesta was one of the very few who had before his mind clear purpose of arriving at a practical solution to the organizing problem, but he had an uphill work to do, and his feelings made him once cry out, we are of an appalling doctrinarianism. Most delegates seemed to want an organization and did not want one, considering every practical step is interfering with their own autonomy. This became a frequent frustration in Malatesta, with everyone unable to even agree on agreement. The whole Congress turned into a bit of a mess, made worse by all the nonsense surrounding the Tsar's assassination. Severio Merlino, the lawyer who helped him in Benevento, and an old university friend of Malatesta who attended the Congress, was a good help. Caffiero was there also, but increasingly retreated into his own world. During the Congress, Malatesta's general points were the following. Quote, he said, amongst other things, we want a revolution. We belong to different schools, but we all want a revolution. We all agree that the insurrection is necessary, one which must destroy the conditions of the present society. Political revolutions aren't enough for our objective, which is to wholly destroy the basis of our current society. And we can't arrive at harmony with those who want dictatorship and centralization. The autonomy of groups is necessary. Is the International itself necessary? Well, a new organization is needed, similar to the International, keeping its name, which emphasizes these principles in a revolutionary way. The economic fight cannot stand alone. A political fight is necessary as well, since property is not destroyed if the authority which maintains it is not destroyed at the same time. Though it's just a very short excerpt from a very long Congress, but the main idea he's trying to promote is a new international built upon anarchist lines, that while maintaining the autonomy of each individual group, works together for a collective cause of opposing the state and capitalism simultaneously. While he was formally successful in getting the International to adopt much of his proposed structure, the whole thing was, in practice, a bit of a flop. It quickly devolved into infighting between organizationalists and anti-organizationalists, and all sections were very often plagued with constant suppression and arrest by the police. These two factors made any real cooperation almost impossible. Oh, and spies. Lots and lots of spies. In one particular case, a spy tried to be all wholesome and take Kropotkin and Malatesta to his aunt's house to show how much of a good revolutionary he was. Malatesta was still super suspicious of the dude, and when walking past a furniture store he noticed by chance that all of the furniture in his supposed aunt's house was exactly the same as a rentable set in the store. Still, he and others did their best to organize the anarchist elements in London, though most concrete attempts slowly fizzled out. This whole period was a time of strife. Exiled from his home, Malatesta was isolated and impoverished. However, one event would stand as the greatest personal tragedy of this time. Carlo Caffiero, now one of Malatesta's oldest and most reliable friends, began a downward spiral both physically and mentally. The first signs began to show in early 1881. Andrea Costa's defection hurt most of the old Italian crew and greatly shook the whole movement. His adoption of reformist tactics while still claiming to be a revolutionary came across as many as manipulative, and many others felt like whether he realized it or not, he was just acting this way for his own benefit. Savio Merlino agreed as much, saying, quote, "By not having the courage to confess himself a legalitarian, he continues to pretend to be what he no longer is to deceive himself and others." Still, while they greatly opposed Costa and some even broke off contact with him completely, most refrained from outright hostility and threats. Gaffiello, up until July of 1881, did the same until his attacks on Costa became personal and fanatic. He, for the first time, denounced his old friend by name, claiming in a letter dated July 21st that, quote, "Costa is an apostate, a renegade of the revolutionary faith of the people." He then went on to call him a careerist, claiming that he was only acting for his own benefit and had given in to greed and corruption, before claiming that justice had to be brought to him. The letter to Costa was in the immediate aftermath of a complete nervous breakdown. He recovered briefly in mid-1881, but quickly got worse. His physical condition grew poorer and poorer, but what declined the greatest was his mental state. He increasingly believed that everybody was out to get him, that spies were around every single corner, that the walls were closing in, and that everybody he ever knew was going to betray him just like Costa. This worried his friends even more, but any concerns were immediately pushed away by Gaffiello, who continuously retreated into paranoia. At this point, there was only one person he trusted, Malatesta. They'd walk through the streets of London, Malatesta doing his best to help, but Gaffiello only getting worse. They'd sit on the benches of Hyde Park, and as Gaffiello continued to whisper in his ear, Malatesta could only sit by and watch. Gaffiello continued to get worse and worse, as Malatesta tormented himself over what to do. Gaffiello's derangements got more and more severe, and he came to the conclusion that with the exception of Malatesta, quite literally, everybody was out to get him. During one anarchist conference, Gaffiello frantically looked around the room before whispering quietly to Malatesta, quote, "Can't you see? They're all spies." He tried killing himself soon after. He returned to Italy in 1883, where he completely descended into madness. He ran around naked in Florence before being found standing in a pool of frigid water. By the time he reached a doctor, he was convulsing uncontrollably. His long-absent wife, Olympia, returned to try and help. In 1886, he was transferred to a mental institution, where his physical health, at the very least, began to improve. He was visited around this time by Malatesta, who, unlike other friends, he could at least recognize. Still, as Fabbri says, quote, "Poor Gaffiello made such absurd and extravagant speeches that all possible hope of recovery was lost." He drifted in and out of lucidity, periods of calm punctuated by periods of extreme crisis. He was released in 1887, where he lived under his wife's care until 1889, where following another extreme episode, he was returned to an asylum. Gaffiello died of tuberculosis on July 17, 1892. He was only 45. Malatesta, whom Gaffiello was like a brother to, was absolutely devastated. He He later called it one of the greatest sorrows of his life. We could speculate for ages what causes insanity. Maybe it was some weird love affair, maybe it was a disease, or maybe it was being repeatedly driven from his home and imprisoned. Either way, when he lived, he was a shining example of the generosity, kindness, and tenacious fighting spirit that anarchism aspires towards. We should not treat him like a martyr, but we should always continue fighting for those ideals. With his insanity and death, the final chain of the old alliance definitively broke. And with that, Malatesta was the only one left standing. Maybe, for once in his life full of action, Gaffiello will be able to rest.
Dei malfattori, detta fretta sorgere, o sol dell'avvenir, vivere voglian liberi, non voglian più servir, poi lor vedremo sorgere, il sol dell'avvenir, in pace potrem vivere.
Malatesta, however, was never one to quit, and though he was devastated, he continued to fight on. He seemingly planned to return to Italy from the very moment he left, but was always kept busy and the threat of imprisonment loomed over him. But tired of waiting, and with nothing remaining for him in London, he finally set off back home. He secretly arrived in Florence around March of 1883. The Italian Anarchist movement had some major problems facing it. Malatesta was in exile, Gaffiello was deranged, and Costa was increasingly bringing previous revolutionaries into his new clique. Malatesta set out to reconcile the situation, though he wasn't alone. Saverio Merlino had returned to Italy a little bit before Malatesta, and was working to promote anarchism and combat Costa's influence. He met up with Malatesta on his arrival, and he and a few other anarchists began quick work on creating a new paper. Malatesta's goals at this time were to keep the anarchist-leaning portions of the Italian socialist movement united and resistant against reformism. Thanks to Merlino's work, this was made a bit easier as he consistently challenged Costa's narrative while the other prominent Italian anarchists were out of the picture. Malatesta worked during this time as a mechanic, something which he would become very familiar with. Refusing donations from other anarchists, refusing to take up paid work in organized labor, and refusing to become a full-time editor or academic meant that he was always working to survive, and very often lived in almost impoverished conditions. Still, his skill as a mechanic and electrician meant that he could usually find work somewhere, even if fairly meager. During this time, what money he didn't need he slowly saved up to contribute to the creation of this new paper. However, the police increasingly began to realize that Malatesta was around, and alerted various officials to be on the lookout. Their new paper, Il Popolo, barely got off the ground before the law came down on them. Only one issue was released in May before Malatesta, Merlino, and all of the others involved were arrested. They were all charged with a criminal conspiracy, but the Italian government had one major problem. Being charged with a criminal conspiracy meant that they could be arrested before they were even convicted. However, it also meant that they had to be taken to a higher court. That higher court had a much higher standard of evidence than the lower courts, and as it turned out, the Italian government had basically no evidence of a crime besides a flimsy manifesto from before Malatesta was even in the country, and the testimony of a coerced 18-year-old. As such, they had a bit of a dilemma. They could lower the charges and ensure a conviction, but then the suspects would be provisionally released until convicted. The Italian government waited as long as possible, keeping Malatesta in jail for 6 months and the rest for 8 months, but eventually downgraded the charges to just association of ne'er-do-wells. This meant that the suspects were released until convicted, which presented Malatesta and the others an important opportunity. They began work on La Question Sociale, a paper which he would continue in multiple forms for decades, and which would become one of the largest anarchist papers he'd work on. He wrote dozens of issues of it, and due to a very clever trick, without any interference from the Italian government. This was because, to arrest him for producing the new paper, they would have to make new charges and would potentially go against a judge who was more skeptical of the charges, or even worse, a jury, which had a pattern of releasing revolutionaries. Because of this, they did nothing, and Malatesta and the others produced the paper almost completely unobstructed for months until their other charges could be settled. They were eventually sentenced to multiple years in prison, but they appealed and were once again granted provisional liberty until reconvicted. This continued until April of 1885, nearly 2 years. During this time, they continued to expand the anarchist movement in Italy, making easily accessible and widely distributed articles and pamphlets in multiple regions of the country. La Question Sociale would become, so far, Malatesta's most successful paper. This couldn't go on forever though, and they eventually lost their appeal. They were sentenced to multiple years in prison each, but not being in police custody, they simply left the country. As Nettlau comically put it, quote, "The government had to stand by just waiting whether he would choose to be at their beck and call for 3 more years' prison. He decided not to waste his life, of which they saw so many months already, and instead chose to leave." During this time, likely for partially personal reasons and partially political reasons, Malatesta and a few other friends set off to Buenos Aires. They arrived in 1885, where Malatesta immediately set up a mechanic shop for funds and organized a socialist circle to make a new paper. Buenos Aires at the time was full of Italian immigrants and radicals, which put Malatesta even more in his element. He set up La Question Sociale in Buenos Aires, publishing a few editions throughout 1885. His paper didn't hold nearly the same importance as it did back in Florence, but as it faded out, he began work on other, more direct activities. His most important work was helping to organize the various labor groups in the city. He held speeches, debates, and along with a close contingent of other anarchists such as Galileo Balli and Cesare Agostinelli, tried to bind together the various labor movements in the city under their revolutionary banner. He, along with others from Argentina and abroad, met with immediate success, a lot of it having to do with the general revolutionary uptick in the city following the large amounts of immigrants. One of his closest allies in Buenos Aires would be Ettore Mate, who along with the others created a sort of revolutionary nucleus in the city. I do want to emphasize that this was a general movement. Malatesta didn't just magically come in and start it all. Still, he caught a wave and made the absolute best of it, playing a fairly large role in the Buenos Aires movement. They continued their same activities for a few more years, trying to stoke the flames of the Argentine movement. There was an incident with Galileo Palla, where the police accused him of making counterfeit bills and tried linking the whole thing to Malatesta. It would be disproved shortly after, though the Italian police would keep note of the incident. Agostinelli was the first to leave, returning to Ancona in 1888. Malatesta left the following year in 1889. But the Argentine movement didn't just stop after they left. Ettore Mate would be the most consistent agitator, promoting anarchism in Argentina until his death in 1915. The movement had a strong organizationalist tendency, following the influence of Malatesta and his like. This was further bolstered with the arrival of prominent anarchists like Pietro Gori. I'll explain the whole organizationalist versus anti-organizationalist debate a bit more later, as it is one of the largest divides in the anarchist movement of the time. But, for those who don't have any background knowledge, at its most basic, the organizationalists believe that people on their own are powerless, subject to the abuse of the government and other coercive entities. That ultimately, without organization, anarchism is limited to petty attacks and small-time acts of resistance. Basically, without organization, you can bomb a police station, but you can't produce the forces necessary to disband the police. Therefore, an organization is necessary for any anarchist movement to have any success, so long as that organization is built without a hierarchy and in a voluntary fashion. Anti-organizationalists believe that any formal organization is at risk of corruption or interception by the police. Rather than forming large organizations, they prefer to form affinity groups of trusted allies to work in a directly revolutionary manner. They believe this to be necessary to prevent the formation of hierarchies or other suppressive forces. Anyway, the anarchist movements would thrive in Argentina for some time. Malatesta and the crew were still remembered well into the 1920s. This continued until the so-called infamous decade and the subsequent Perón dictatorship. From there on, anarchism in Argentina, along with other similar movements, were subject to widespread suppression and the movement shattered. Still, that's definitely way out of the scope of this video, so back to Malatesta. He returned to France for a short while, publishing a paper called L'Associazione. He left France shortly after due to the police searching for him, and he returned, once more, to the Defendi's house on Islington High Street. He continued publishing L'Associazione in London. One of the paper's main goals was to form a sort of united anarchist front, leaving the exact differences in economic direction to each individual revolutionary group and proposing a general alliance so long as the wider anarchist principles were still upheld. This was mostly to try and reconcile some of the differences between collectivist and communist anarchists, a divide which was getting increasingly violent at the time. While being a champion of anarchist communism himself, he believed that the differences were ultimately minor enough that they should work together rather than tearing themselves apart. Ultimately, he believed that the exact economic goals of a revolution varied so greatly on the specific conditions of that revolution that fighting over it when the revolution wasn't even close was a pointless task. In Malatesta's own words, quote, "In all these matters, it is necessary to draw a line between that which is scientifically demonstrated and that which remains at the stage of hypothesis. It is necessary to distinguish between what must be done in a revolutionary way, that is, by force and immediately, and that which shall be the consequence of future evolution and must be left to the free energies of all, harmonized spontaneously and gradually." There are anarchists who recognize other solutions, other forms of future social organization, but they desire, like we ourselves, the destruction of political power and property. They desire, like we ourselves, the spontaneous reorganization of social functions without delegation of powers and without government. They desire, like we ourselves, to struggle up to the last, up till the final victory. These are also our comrades. Therefore, let us give up exclusivism. Let us well understand each other as to the ways and means, and let us march ahead. Various people contributed to the paper, including old Saverio Merlino. The paper published 7 issues, but was shut down in January of 1890 because one of the so-called comrades disappeared and took all of the paper's money with him. Like usual though, Malatesta didn't let this get him down. He set up his old mechanic shop and continued on like always. This period in London, as it turns out, would be where some of his most famous texts were written. After L'Associazione, Malatesta began work on a series of pamphlets. One thing that's important to mention about Malatesta is that, unlike some other anarchists, he very rarely wrote long treatises or essays. This wasn't due to him being unintellectual or uneducated. In fact, many of those around him repeatedly attested to his wit and understanding. Rather, it was a combination of 2 factors. The first, that he didn't hold any academic job, and instead worked as a manual laborer throughout most of his life. This meant that he could hardly fund or publish long academic essays, and instead relied on anarchist newspapers to distribute his work, newspapers he very often set up himself. The second reason was that he was always an organizer first and foremost, and his work was designed to be accessible and lead directly to revolutionary action. This means his concise pamphlets are really useful to spur the working class into action. Nettlau describes it quite well. Quote, "It is always possible for an individual to march quicker than the masses, to be more brilliant, to appear more advanced, to spend within a few moments at a single stroke the energy of a lifetime. To such, Malatesta seems slow, for all his energy is directed to making quantities of very average people advance in an efficient way, and not to storm ahead of them a long way to have remained in a hopeless isolation. He did that when with 5 others he held Castel del Monte, and when 27 he wandered on to the Matisi Mountains, and not a soul stirred to help him. He now prefers, since 1883 at least, to make large masses see for some very few simple things, and to work for these things with quiet efficiency. This is not moderation, it is very simply preference, given to one method which needs not exclude other methods. There is room for all." However, this also means that this is very annoying for a guy in the 21st century who has to look through dozens of 19th century newspapers on shady websites to avoid paywalls because all of his ideas are distributed across a million different pamphlets in a million different countries in a million different languages, rather than being in one big magnum opus you can get most of the ideas from. Anyway, I'll go over some of the more interesting things he wrote in this time period. This section will be a bit technical, but I promise it'll be worth it. I'll summarize the stuff here, but I'll provide the links to the full text if you're interested. I would recommend reading them if you want to learn more. Anarchy and Organization is a pamphlet written in 1897. He starts off by claiming that organization, in some form or another, is a necessary function of humanity. We're ultimately social animals, and the reason why we are so successful is because of our capability to cooperate with one another for a greater good. Without organization, people are petty and small, isolated and weak. Because of this, any anarchist group advocating against organization entirely is inevitably limited in their scope and ultimately completely unable to make any systematic change. He claims that the only reason why such a small, privileged class can dominate the vast majority is because that majority remains scattered and isolated. He claims that even if with the goal of destroying all forms of organization, a group manages to overturn the government anyway, it doesn't matter as the goals are ultimately flawed. Without organization, the most basic form of hierarchy, the domination of the weak by the strong, will inevitably form and the cycle will start again. Therefore, the question for any anarchist group with any hope of overturning the current system is not whether we need organization, but how that organization should be structured. It's therefore the anarchist's responsibility to make that form of organization that avoids all of the excesses of the state and other institutions. He believes that this is a definite and possible goal without infringing on others' freedom. As he says, quote, "If it is true that organization creates leaders, if it is true that anarchists are unable to come together and arrive at an agreement without submitting themselves to an authority, this means that they are not yet very good anarchists, and before thinking of establishing an anarchist society within the world, they must think of making themselves able to live in an anarchist faction. The remedy does not lie in the abolition of organization, but in the growing consciousness of each individual member. In small as well as large societies, apart from brute force, of course, which cannot be a question for us, the origin and justification for authority lies in social disorganization." He also criticizes some anti-organizationalist anarchists for having vague and theoretical definitions of freedom, with any form of cooperation being construed as a violation of their individual liberty. A modern example would be people who say, "Oh, you want me to work together and listen to your ideas, but who are you to tell me what to do? Not very anarchist, huh?" Malatesta was, seemingly, as frustrated with these people as I am, mainly because it leads absolutely nowhere. To Malatesta, freedom isn't some abstract concept, but instead the real and true possibility of acting free from exploitation, a right which can only be safeguarded through cooperation with others. This is a quote from another text, but one that is personally one of my favorites and really captures the sentiment. Quote, "The freedom we want for ourselves and for others is not an absolute metaphysical abstract freedom, which in practice is inevitably translated into the oppression of the weak, but it is real freedom, possible freedom, which is the conscious community of interests and voluntary solidarity." Another important thing mentioned in this text is his belief that anarchists need to work within the wider labor movement. He doesn't believe in some universal union, and claims that we shouldn't cooperate with groups that are, quote, "built on concessions and assumptions in which there is no real agreement and sympathy possible." But he also cautions against anarchism becoming disconnected with the very people they are advocating for. He ends with, quote, "We have undertaken the task of struggling against the existing social organization, and of overcoming the obstacles to the advent of a new society in which freedom and well-being would be assured to everybody. To achieve this objective, we organize ourselves and seek to become as numerous and as strong as possible. But if it were only our anarchist groupings that were organized, if the workers were to remain isolated like so many units unconcerned about each other and only linked by the common chain, if we ourselves, besides being organized as anarchists in a federation, were not as workers organized with other workers, we could achieve nothing at all, or at most, we might be able to impose ourselves on others, and then it would not be the triumph of anarchism, but our triumph. We could go on calling ourselves anarchists, but in reality, we should simply be rulers, as impotent as all rulers are when the general good is concerned." His advocacy for radical unions and the anarchist participation in the wider labor movement is consistent throughout the 1890s, and he was one of the forerunners in promoting this. However, his position on unions and similar organizations can be a bit confusing at times. Just look at his Wikipedia. He sort of rolled back on some of his beliefs later on, but not really at the same time. Past the 1910s, his support for syndicalism decreased significantly, though it's less that his position changed completely and more that his position evolved with the times. In the late 1800s, a lot of anarchists are still caught up in strictly insurrectionary tactics which Malatesta believed couldn't single-handedly bring anarchy. In this time, he advocated for the adoption of some syndicalist tactics so the anarchists don't lose grip with the wider labor movement. Following the 1910s, a lot of these insurrectionary tendencies began to disappear, and syndicalism became increasingly stagnant and reformist. During this time, he advocated once again for some insurrectionary tactics, claiming that a general strike, no matter how powerful, could never truly replace a revolution. It's less that his position changed, and more that the imbalance of tactics shifted over time. One short interaction between him and Fabbri later in his life shows this whole thing pretty well. Quote, "One day, when we were talking in his little room, I saw a manuscript of his on the table about anarchists and violence. Knowing his ideas on the debate, I asked him if he would have it published. 'No,' he responded. 'This isn't the moment. Today, it seems to me that anarchists suffer from the opposite defect of the violent excesses that occupied me in this article. It's better to react now against the tendencies towards accommodation and living quietly that are showing in our environments. Now, it's more urgent to resuscitate the revolutionary passion that lies languishing, the spirit of sacrifice, the love of risk.'" Basically, the issue is no longer the ultra-violent anarchist, but the complacent one. Speaking of violence, let's talk about his view on it. He wrote a good pamphlet called Violence as a Social Factor in April of 1895, and another good one called Doing Good by Force in 1894. Rather than going through all of them, I'll mostly go over his general positions, which stayed fairly consistent throughout his life. Basically, he knew that some form of violence was necessary. The Tolstoyan style of strict pacifism would get the anarchists nowhere. However, Malatesta believed that the use of violence to force others to do one's bidding was absolutely unacceptable. He believed that the state was a fundamentally violent institution, with the threat of hunger or bayonets being the ultimate base of their power. Because of this, it was the people's right to rebel against such a system, in a reasonable revolutionary self-defense. Not a strict form of self-defense, limited to just retaliating against petty institutions such as the police, but self-defense against the entire system. Basically, rather than attacking the hand, go for the head. However, he was not for revolutionary violence in the same way as, say, the Bolsheviks or other similar groups. While he believed that a revolution was necessary, and that violence against the oppressors was also a necessity, he believed that the revolutionary ideals could never be forcefully imposed on others without betraying everything you're fighting for in the first place. As Fabbri put it, quote, "A revolution is made with force. It couldn't be any other way. But a revolution could never be made by force." There's a few other good pamphlets from this period, though I don't have enough time to cover them all in depth. Errors and Remedies is a pretty good one about his opinion on the wide variety of anarchists and how to best cooperate with them. I could not find an audio version online, but I linked the text below. Duties of the Present Hour is good as well, also linked. The Anarchist's Task is pretty good also. Zoe Baker has an audio version of that, so I linked her video as well as the actual text. There's a bunch more if you're interested. You will pretty much never run out of random Malatesta articles, but these are the ones I thought needed to be covered for this portion. Anyway, back to his life. While he never gave up his hopes of returning to Italy, London during this time became his new home in exile. It sort of acted as a home base for him, a launching point for all of his trips to the continent, and a place where he could always return once the situation there became too dangerous. The first of these trips occurred around 1890. During it, he snuck off to Paris, where Andrea Costa was residing. Through the mediation of Amilcare Scipiani, the two old members of the alliance made up some of their differences, though this was partially superficial. Scipiani is an interesting character himself. He was a veteran of Garibaldi, narrowly avoided execution after the Paris Commune, and he's a bit of a bizarre character, and I can't figure out whether he's an anarchist, a follower of Costa, or something in between. He did run for public office, and was elected for 8 terms in the Italian Chamber of Deputies, but he never actually served them because he refused to swear loyalty to the king. Anyway, following this, Malatesta was off to Switzerland in January of 1891. The Capolago Congress was to be held. Technically, all socialists were invited, but only 3 non-anarchists showed up. Among those attending were Pietro Gori, Merlino, Francesco Scini, and also Cipriani, who according to Fabbri, quote, "at that moment declared himself to be an anarchist." Whatever the hell that means. Besides most of the people I just listed being arrested before the Congress even started, it went fairly well. Among those arrested, Malatesta included, they were released shortly after by Swiss authorities. He likely returned to London following this, though not for long. In Spain, around February of 1892, there was something known as the Mano Negra affair, not to be confused with that Mano Negra. Basically, it was an alleged group of anarchists that the Spanish government claimed were responsible for a multitude of violent crimes throughout Spain. I say alleged because the very existence of the group is very, very disputed. Some say it was a false flag attack, some say that the group existed but could not have possibly committed the plethora of accused crimes, which were throughout the entire south of the country and would have required a nearly nationwide conspiracy, and others claimed that the group was completely imaginary. Evidence is lacking, and one thing that is very clear is that it played exactly into the hands of the Spanish government, who was very keen to launch a widespread campaign of persecution against the labor movement in their country. With some vague documents used as proof of the conspiracy, the Spanish government set out to arrest as many anarchists as possible to link them with the crime. This is further sensationalized by the Spanish press, who turned the group from a small anarchist crime cell into some nationwide suicide cult where members were executed for failing assassinations. Of course, there was very little proof for any of this. Dozens of people were rounded up, 4 of whom were eventually executed. All the while, the National Federation of Spanish Workers felt the need to make multiple articles basically saying, well, we're not like those anarchists. All the while, multiple of their friends and comrades faced execution. Kropotkin in his paper did rightfully call them out for this lack of solidarity. Suffice to say, this was a major time of repression in Spain, an extremely dangerous period for all socialists. So, Malatesta decided to go on a speaking tour across the country. He held multiple public debates and speeches, all with his explicitly anarchist background being fully known. As Nettlau hilariously put it, quote, his appearance there was such a novelty that the Spanish police took some time to decide how to act, and meanwhile, he departed in the nick of time. He then returned to his London home in exile. He assisted with the publication of various anarchist papers in these years, and like I've said before, wrote some of his most influential early works. He did come into conflict with other anarchists, many of whom wrote fierce criticisms of him in La Revolte and the ominously named paper The Dagger. He spent a lot of time from 1891 to 1892 responding to these criticisms as well as making more points of his own. These debates began to reflect the general splits in the anarchist movement at the time, the morality and practicality of assassinations, how unions should be used if at all, a collectivist versus a communist economic mode, and much, much more. Some anarchists on all sides of the debate got, to say the least, very heated in these criticisms. He made a quick excursion to Belgium in 1893, going with Carlo Malato in spite of his exile. He secretly went to Italy in 1894, hiding out with Merlino and the others. He spent some days in Ancona before the police caught him. He then fled to London and the rest fled to Paris, though Merlino was found and arrested for a bit. During this time in exile, Fabbri claims, quote, he exercised more than a small influence in this period, from 1892 to 1895, over the French anarchists living in London during the persecutions which followed the frequent assassinations of those years. This influence is also responsible for the impetus with which some refugees who returned to France gave themselves over to a methodical work of penetrating the labor movement. One of his main goals at the time was to ensure that anarchism was connected to the wider labor movement rather than withering away in the corner. He believed that even if anarchist ideas were correct, it'd do them no good if they couldn't connect with the working class. This idea already had some traction in Italy and amongst the Italian comrades in exile, but was less popular in France at the time. As Nettlau explains, quote, the fact underlying these differences of opinion between the Italian and French comrades of that time was that Malatesta never ceased to believe in the possibility of real general action, while in France at that time, contact with the people had been considered as hopelessly lost, and propaganda by the deed, individual action, and personal acts of protest seemed the only means available. The rediscovery of syndicalism in 1895 altered this mentality. However, it would become increasingly hard for anarchists to operate in mainland Europe. In the wake of multiple high-profile assassinations carried out by the likes of Ravachol, Emile Henry, and Luigi Lucchini, a wave of arrests and persecutions spread throughout Europe. Described by Fabbri, quote, from mid-1894 to early 1896, there was a period of strong reaction against anarchists in almost all of Europe, and its press fell silent almost everywhere for more than a year. It was still possible to do something in England, and many refugees took shelter in London, especially those from Italy and France. The house and the business of the defending couple, where Malatesta lived on 112 Islington High Street, was a convergence point for everyone that arrived in London. How many stormy and brotherly discussions were had in that little kitchen, through the grocery store of the good defending family, that served as an athenaeum, and how many projects, hopes, and sorrows took place in those halls. It was amidst the strong number of socialist refugees in London that a regular congress was planned for the latter half of 1885. It was a congress of the Second International, which had previously expelled all anarchists from it in 1889. The anarchists sought to repeal this decision, or at the very least, have some form of reconciliation. From his home in Islington High Street, he did all in his power to campaign for his fellow anarchists. He wasn't alone, however, not even close. As Nettlau said, quote, there is certainly nobody of any interest to anarchists whom he did not know in these years. I will just mention Kropotkin, Cherkov, Molado, Lucien Guenea, Emile Pouget, Victor Richard, Lorenzo Portet, and other Catalonians. No doubt also Alicia Cluse, who was in London in 1895, and the then submerged or invisible Paul Reclus. At the time of the International Congress of 1896, he would of course know F. Domela Neuschis, Tom Mann, Gilles Landau, and all who then showed any desire to see fair play. During the conference, Malatesta ended up playing a fairly large role. He was able to get past some of the Marxist obstructionary tactics and advocate for the anarchist side, though it wasn't enough. Rather than this Congress being a minor reconciliation, a slight edge to the libertarian socialists, it instead proved to be a final split. The Marxists agreed to reaffirm the expulsion of all anarchists from future Congresses of the International. This was a sentiment that would last through all four internationals, though by the time of those later ones the Marxists were too busy fighting amongst themselves to worry about the anarchists. and with it, all future anarchist internationals will be completely separate from the Marxist ones. So rather than reconciliation, this Congress only reaffirmed the scars that the Hague Conference left nearly 30 years before.
Nostra patria il mondo intero, nostra legge è la libertà, ed un pensiero, nostra patria il mondo intero, nostra legge è la libertà, ed un pensiero, ribelle ancora ci sta.
He didn't stay much longer in London, as following this conference, his conviction in Italy all the way back in 1884 had technically expired. To add to this, an issue had arisen in Italy while he was away. Merlino, though intelligent and kind, had gradually began slipping away from the anarchist movement. This reached its height in 1897. While he was still firmly opposed to Marxism, his faith in anarchism began to decrease more and more. His intelligence and wit made it a rising problem to the Italian movement, with most other prominent anarchists stuck in exile. Malatesta sought to challenge his old friend Merlino, so in 1897, he and Emilia's son Enrico ventured to Ancona, Italy. The rift between Malatesta and Merlino, though growing, still remained mostly political. It never reached the furious heights of Costa's defection, and Merlino's politics didn't change nearly as greatly as Costa's did. The culmination of this meant that, though their positions grew apart, the debates remained mostly civil. Malatesta once again set up l'agitazione in Ancona, using it to counter Merlino and spread the general anarchist sentiment throughout Italy. He let Merlino write essentially whatever he wanted in the paper, later on using his writings to counter his points. Fabbri describes the situation and ultimate outcome like this. Quote, Merlino's extraordinary ingenuity and learning, his obvious good faith, and the influence of his name made the menace that much more dangerous. Malatesta didn't hesitate to take a stand, though preserving the utmost calm and cordiality in the argument they held. A brief discussion between the two had already taken place through public letters in a Roman daily, and it was pursued at length in l'agitazione, in the first issue, and all throughout that year. When the controversy ceased, its effects were evident. Almost no anarchists followed Merlino. The only notable exception was the young lawyer Nunzio, who later became one of the most eloquent socialist representatives. Merlino remained isolated, too revolutionary, eclectic, and independent to be accepted in the socialist scene, but too legislative for the anarchists, though they continued to remain on the most friendly terms until his eventual death. L'agitazione had considerable success, though this was limited as Malatesta was still technically in hiding. Despite this, however, he didn't shy away from doing everything possible to interact with other socialists and bring them to the anarchist cause. One particular example is that of Giuseppe Ciancabelli. He was previously a socialist who, when conducting an interview of Malatesta with Avanti, quickly switched camps. Fabbri also met Malatesta for the first time, being led to his hiding place in Ancona for a long discussion, though that's a story for later. L'agitazione provided a sort of nucleus for the Italian anarchist movement, in a similar way to Malatesta's work in London. Anarchists of all sorts contributed to the paper, and it quickly became extremely popular. Malatesta himself stayed consistent with many of his positions from London. He continued advocating for organization, the adoption of syndicalism, and for direct action in the movement. He also wrote some criticisms of Kropotkin, who he believed put too much emphasis on spontaneous harmony rather than the practicality of building a movement. However, like with most people he criticized, he refrained from personal attacks and tried not to call people out by name. This actually garnered some criticism, mainly due to the view that he was being far too soft. Fabbri describes the situation with the following. Quote, the language he used to argue propaganda and critique the active institutions was serene, completely devoid of verbal violence and rhetoric. There were comrades who reproached him at times for being too English, but he replied that he preferred to speak in a way that would be understood and accepted by the public, rather than writing in a grating fashion that would only appeal to the converted, distancing himself from the people or provoking the seizure of the paper. That would be the same as not saying anything. In l'agitazione, he experimentally showed how the most transgressive and audacious things could be said with the least violent and most reasonable words. This, it could be argued, contributed to the paper's rising popularity amongst the working class of Italy. However, with popularity came attention, and the Italian police were back to do what they do best. Rumors had already had it that he was gone from London, and dozens of spies began searching for him all throughout Italy. They had a pretty good idea that he was in Ancona and working on the paper, so they began searching houses of known anarchists in the hopes of finding him. Papers were seized, many were arrested, but no matter what, Malatesta evaded capture. Was he hiding in an underground bunker? Was he wearing an elaborate disguise so that nobody could see him? Was he, in fact, a shapeshifter? No, quite the opposite actually. Fabbri describes the situation as such. Quote, Surprisingly, Malatesta rarely hit himself physically. The only precaution he took was to leave the house alone and never in the company of other anarchists. At times, known rivals would come across him, and he didn't refrain from holding several conferences in the area, where he simply presented himself by the name of Giuseppe Rinaldi. A bit later, in a letter published in L'Agitazione pretending to be written from a distant little Italian town, he protested against the snooping police. In the letter, he acknowledged that he had been in Italy all along, but wrote that he was avoiding public attention in order to stay out of prison, since the old sentence from Rome was still a threat regardless of whatever right he had to be left in peace. He hid in plain sight, amazingly avoiding capture for over 9 months. He was eventually captured, but in the weirdest situation. He was hiding in another house of an anarchist, and like usual, many anarchists came and went from the house to visit Malatesta. One of their wives eventually got fed up for all these mystery visits, and thinking that her husband was going somewhere to cheat on her, followed him to the house. She thought she found out who it was, another woman living across the hall from Malatesta. So she started yelling at this woman on the street, claiming that she knew what was going on. The other woman, offended at the accusation, said that her husband never visited her, and was instead going to see someone hidden across the hall. With how public and heated this interaction was, it turned into a small scandal in the town. Rumors spread that there was a mysterious hidden man people came and went from. The other comrades told Malatesta it'd be wise to swap houses, but Malatesta, tired of constantly moving around, decided to stay and see what happened. The next day, the police came barging in, and sitting at a desk, calmly writing some pamphlets, was Malatesta. He was promptly arrested and interrogated by the police. There was one issue, however. The charge had already expired. After spending months looking for and harassing this man, with him finally in their grasp, they realized they couldn't do anything. This only lasted for a short while though, as in late 1897, riots broke out through the whole country in reaction to the rising price of food. As starvation spread throughout the South, the riots intensified. During this time, he and other anarchists were arrested. They were once again charged with being a criminal association and faced jail. However, they made an interesting choice for their defense. Rather than falling back on the old defense of not being an association, they instead claimed to be organized. According to Fabbri, this led to dozens of protests proclaiming the right to organize. Thousands of anarchists signed a manifesto proclaiming their right to remain organized and declared total solidarity with the trial in Ancona. The trial quickly became something much greater and evolved into a general fight for civil liberties throughout Italy. Dozens of anarchists testified in favor of Malatesta and the crew, including Pietro Gori and old Savio Merlino. The trial became a massive spectacle, but ultimately ended in their conviction. The one gain they had was that the charge of criminal association, which carried a heavier sentence, was dropped. Their stunt of claiming to be organized likely resulted in their conviction in the first place, but it ultimately resulted in anarchists only being seen as subversives, which carried a much lighter sentence. Malatesta himself was sentenced to 7 months in prison. The sentence was met with immediate and massive outrage. On May 8th, massive protests erupted throughout the country. The Italian government, however, only reacted by cracking down even more. Special measures were put into place by the Italian parliament, granting them emergency powers to quell the protests. Malatesta, though supposed to be released in August, was instead sentenced to 5 more years of prison due to these special measures. This time, he was sent to a secluded island to prevent any chance of escape. With this, Malatesta and the others were carted away. Italy lay in turmoil, and Malatesta could only watch. Though seemingly defeated, he immediately began planning his next move, but for the time being, Malatesta is trapped. Where he goes from here, I will explain soon enough. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and the final part is coming very soon. Have a great day.
Momenti di passione, giornate di dolore.
Ti scrivo cara mamma, domani c'è l'azione.
compaiono lucenti, sono libertari nulla più. Coraggio è sempre avanti, la morte nulla più. Coraggio è sempre avanti, la morte nulla più. Bombardano i cannoni dai monti sarzanelli, allerta partigiani.